So the Utah Jazz Sports Illustrated page actually ended up dropping an article talking about the 3 decisions that fast-tracked the Utah Jazz rebuild. And while I agree with them to a certain extent, I also would like to expand upon them a little bit, so I just decided to make a video out of it because I needed a topic for today. With that being said, it's your boy Ray Tubes. Thank you for tuning in this video. Go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe, turn on post notifications, and without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into this one. This article was compiled by Alex White, who I would love to give credit to because he gave the idea for the video, of course. Now, with that being said, to jump right into it, the first point that he brought up was the hiring of Will Hardy, which technically did happen before the Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert trades, but those were effectively the key cogs in the machine, if you will, of what ended up leading to where we are at this current moment. Will Hardy ended up signing the 5-year deal. He was the youngest coach in the NBA at the time, as a matter of fact. So it was very interesting, and I think that it was backed up the fact that they ended up giving him that deal because despite overall totaling after, I want to say like 2 seasons, it was roughly a 68 and 96 record, which isn't terrifically impressive, of course, but overall he did what he was supposed to do. So for me, it was a thing of understanding the context behind his numbers. A lot of times, for example, last year, they ended up winning less than 40 games. But there was a significant stretch of basketball where, despite having a less talented overall roster, many people would argue, the Utah Jazz were effectively beating teams that were definitely better than them. And they were also handling teams that were in their relative stratosphere in the ability to just stay in certain games that they probably shouldn't have had the talent or the capability of actually being in the water with the other team overall. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, a whole lot and a whole lot of question marks, because that means Will Hardy is going to maximize his talent, especially when he doesn't have a lot of it or when people don't necessarily understand how the cogs can work. Because in my opinion, Colin Sexton was already a better player than Jordan Clarkson, but the idea was to start Jordan Clarkson out the gate. Well, Colin Sexton ended up earning his minutes later on, and it made sense because he ended up putting some pretty good numbers. Similarly, we ended up running a lot of Keyonte George, and he really didn't start taking to the systems until really later on in the season. Similar with John Collins, who really struggled mightily defensively, but then ended up riding the ship as soon as the rumors of him possibly being traded started to, run amok. That being said, though, looking to the future, I think that the question is going to be when the chips are on the table and when it really matters most, will Will Hardy still be able to lead these guys to victories and meaningful victories? Because right now there is an expectation where you want the Jazz to lose, but he has been known to make bad rosters still relevant, which means that it can kind of get in the way of it as long as you have players that buy into what he's saying enough. That said, looking forward to the future, you can't really have that, particularly this season in 2024 going into 2025. After that, you'll probably want to start winning games again immediately. So by default, yes, you would prefer him to be able to motivate those guys into winning games, especially the young guys, because they want to feel like they have the ability to compete. Winning and losing is part of the game. Not everybody can have a perfect 82-0 season. That just doesn't happen. It's never happened in history. It probably will never happen in history unless the league just goes to absolute dog water. He is the ideal coach for a young squad. I personally believe himself still being a young coach in his age, and overall just being a genuine and believable guy. I've never seen a press conference where I thought he said the wrong thing. I've never seen a press conference where I felt like he threw people under the bus that didn't deserve to be thrown under the bus. And more often than not, he's taking accountability for a lot of the stuff on his own above everything else, because he is the person that ultimately lays out the guys on the court. He's the one that draws up the play calls. Whether the players execute them or not is based on the tools that they have set in place and the different plans that they have set in place, and the mechanisms as far as practice routines, and then also in-game, are their personalities going to clash? Are they going to actually trust him enough to follow the game plan? Because a lot of times there is a lot to be said about some players that just don't go with the status quo, if you will. But I definitely think that Will Hardy has done a really good job with the roster. And while I have had a couple gripes with certain rotations and lineups that he threw out last year, I do think that overall he is the coach that we would like to ride this gambling wave with. The second thing that Alex brought up was drafting Keyonte George. He said Keyonte George specifically, but I'd like to add a little asterisk on there and say Taylor Hendricks as well. Now, Bryce Sensabaugh for me has been a little bit of a heads or tails coin flip. I don't know what exactly he is yet, because I like some of his shots, but I also don't love the fact that defensively sometimes he seems to struggle a little bit. He's not the girthiest as far as strength, nor is he the slimmest as far as athleticism goes. He's kind of a tweener, but I don't hate it. I am willing to allow him to prove who he is as a player as time goes on. That said, I expect more from both Taylor Hendricks and Keyonte George. Keyonte George offensively has to make more shots, right? He shot low 30s from the three-point range, and from the field, he shot high 30s. So those aren't great percentages no matter how you look at it. Taylor Hendricks ended up playing the latter half of the season with the actual main team. Other than that, he was a G League star, actually on the G League Stars, believe it or not. So he didn't really have a lot of tape coming into it, and a lot of people felt like he was already a bust. And I would disagree with that because he has the size, he has the length, he has the athleticism, and he has the instincts defensively, especially help side. Offensively, he ended up dabbling in the three-point ball, and it actually worked out really well for him. And I would hope that it can continue the trend into this season, especially being on the main roster, working alongside Larry Markkinen, who is top one, maybe if you think Karl Anthony Towns is above him, top two big men shooting in the league. So from a corner spot up situation, I would love to have Taylor Hendricks on the court. When it comes to just offensive games overall that need to round out, I think that his will be one that's important. And Keyonte George, they need to decide, is he going to be a point guard? Is he going to be the off guard? Where do you slot him? Because me personally, I think Colin Sexton is too good to be a sixth man. But I know some people feel like his size is holding him back. Well, I think that Colin Sexton is a better defender at this point than Keyonte George is. Now, of course, that comes with reps and opportunity and just honestly sometimes effort, which Colin Sexton, we all know, doesn't lack. I think that Isaiah Collier is a little bit further behind, and I won't really discuss too much on this draft class that we just had, even though I think it's really good on paper because we need to see a sample size of games where they're actually doing stuff. But I do agree that Keyonte George was a big step in the right direction. I would also, like I said, add in Taylor Hendricks, though, because from the deepest side of the ball, he presents a lot of what we need. And the idea of having a prime Taylor Hendricks with a waning prime Larry Markkinen on the court at the same time would be very tantalizing, especially if Walker Kessler ends up panning out, because then that puts you into a situation where, guess what? You also have a tremendously huge front court that has a lot of switchability. And while Walker Kessler isn't the greatest on the perimeter, he's also not a Rudy Gobert type cone. He's a lot more fluid, not as fluid as perhaps Victor Wembanyama, but he still moves pretty decently. And at the rim, he's one of the best shot blockers despite going into his third year. First and second year, Walker Kessler was very good at the rim, especially compared to the other league greats. The last thing that he said was extending Larry Markkinen. Now, I was a proponent for extending Larry Markkinen the entire time. I understood that people's concerns were, oh, we would win too many games. But in my head, if you consider Giannis to be a small forward, and there's somebody else off the top of my head that I cannot come up with the name of, but we're looking at really like Karl Anthony Towns, a Jaren Jackson Jr. maybe, Zion Williamson for sure, Draymond. Those are four guys that you would probably put in the same stratosphere from a power forward standpoint. But if you end up putting Giannis into the small forward category, because he doesn't really run the 4 too heavy, at least in most lineups, and then the 5, because they have Brook Lopez, he doesn't need to, thank goodness for him, because it allows him to round out his game a little bit. That puts us on in the same stratosphere as those teams that have really long and really tall fields to run. Now, of course, you could say Paolo Banchero, but I would say he's more of a small forward. He has more of a on-ball type of game, whereas Larry Markkinen is a perfect supporting piece. And if you think that Keyonte George is going to be your shot creator of the future and your general of your offense, and even if you tank this year and you add Cooper Flagg, those guys are on-ball guys. Those aren't off-ball scorers. And while Keyonte George does show some flashes of that potential, he hasn't done it nearly come on a really just trustworthy enough basis for me to say, oh yeah, this is going to be a big facet of his game going forward. It's not terrible, but he actually shot better off the dribble by, I want to say 2%, if memory serves me right, than he did off the catch, which I actually found to be very interesting because he seemed to have a lot more open jumpers off the catch. But nevertheless, I think that, yes, Larry Markkinen is a top 5 to top 7 power forward, depending on who you consider to be a power forward in today's league, of course, as the game becomes a little bit more positionless than it was in past years. But overall, I think that with him still being with the Utah Jazz, him being 27, even if this developmental stage takes 3 more years and you're looking at mid-20s Walker Kessler and mid-20s Keontae George. You still have the ability to have a late 20s Colin Sexton, assuming they don't trade him, and you'll still have a early 30s Larry Markkinen. And judging by his skill set, his prime will probably last a lot longer than most people's at a high level of basketball because of his shot diet. He doesn't do a lot of on-ball stuff. Now, I would like for him to do a little bit more and get a little bit more comfortable, but overall, I don't want to take away from what makes him the player that we all know him to be, which is his ability to shoot like no other. With that being said, though, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Is there another thing that you think has helped fast track the Utah Jazz besides obviously the Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert trades that ended up jumpstarting all the draft capital that they had? But let me know what you guys think. Of course, as always, like the video, subscribe, turn on post notifications if you made it this far in the video, become a member or drop a donation to help support the content. And as always, it's been your boy Wraith Hoops. Good morning, good evening, and good night, no matter where you're on the globe watching. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.